Hello, everyone. So my name is Susritha Kopparapu. I am a bio-CMG and computer science double major, and my advisor for this project was Dr. Carrie Preston. But this is an evaluation of Together We Feel Better, which is a mental health workbook for Palestinian children ages 6 to 8 and their parents. So for today's agenda, I want to walk you through the need for an intervention within this population. And from there, we'll talk about how the workbook was developed. I'll dive into both the content of the workbook and the survey, and then wrap up with with challenges and limitations, and then concluding significance from the evaluation. Okay, so when people say the Palestinian diaspora, one of the first conflicts that comes to mind is the Arab-Israeli War in 1948. People who experienced that are now grandparents or great-grandparents. But this conflict is ongoing, and an example of that is the Gaza conflict in 2021. And children in these situations are especially vulnerable. They face both the effects of transgenerational trauma compounded with present-day war and violence that surrounds them. So to get a better idea of the mental health needs of Palestinian children, I pulled this figure from the Mental Health Psychosocial Support Services intervention. This intervention strives to provide mental health resources and treatment for children. So what you're looking at here is the blue line represents the number of children who have a need for mental health treatment. And then the orange line represents the number of children who are actually able to be reached with this program. But there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. The first is that the blue line is an underestimate. Mental health stigma is very much prevalent within these communities. So it leads to people not recognizing that they have issues that would require treatment. So inherently, this number is an underestimate. Another point is that this data is a subset. So this data comes from children in the West Bank and Gaza regions, but families are located in many other places. So this number, again, is just a subset and is an underestimate. But let's talk about the intervention itself. So in 2015, this program had full funding, and yet there's this gap in between how many children were able to be reached and the need that this community had. Around 2017, this program started to lose funding, and we really see the effects of that in 2019, at which point that gap just gets larger. So the main takeaway from all of this is that there's a lot of need for mental health interventions within this community. And a couple of interventions, especially ones with a heavy dependence on funding, are not going to be enough to bridge the gap. So this is where the idea for the workbook came into play. In the Kilachand 302 course, our group and I had a goal to come up with a feasible intervention. We had the idea to introduce concepts of mental health through a couple of workbook pages that could be introduced into existing Earn-Want textbooks. From there, my group mates Audrey Hager and Aidan Kamner, we were working with the Summer Institute for Research on Forced Displacement, where we fleshed out the idea and reached out to organizations, including the Palestinian Red Crescent Society. There, with the aid of their psychologists, we put together a 3-section standalone workbook that is now translated to Arabic, and the English version is getting passed around somewhere. Finally, for my Keystone, I proposed measuring the efficacy of this workbook, and I got Institutional Review Board approval for a mixed style questionnaire, which the PRCS has translated. So from here, the next step is distribution of both the workbook and the survey, which unfortunately has been delayed. But before I get into that, I do want to talk about what I have, which is both the workbook and the survey. So the workbook has 3 sections: how am I feeling today, understanding anxiety, and sharing my thoughts and feelings. This is the cover. I had the pleasure of illustrating as well as co-authoring this, but to talk about the components. So the first is that every section comes with a story. These stories have characters. The characters face some problem and overcome that challenge. Then the stories are followed with post-story questions, the purpose of which is to engage both the parents and children in conversation, or maybe even children and other peers. Next, every section has 3 activities or exercises. These are here to promote healthy habits or provide coping mechanisms. And each of these comes with that boxed off parents note section that just provides more context and awareness for whatever is being discussed. Finally, every section has a take-home message, and the take-home message just wraps up the main takeaway of that section. So the survey is to be completed by parents after their children and them have gone through the workbook as they please. And the survey is in mixed style, so it contains multiple choice, check all that apply, a Likert scale, so strongly agree to strongly disagree, and open response. The goal of having a mixed style questionnaire was that I could gather both quantitative as well as qualitative data to get a better understanding of the family's experience with the workbook. The survey itself has 5 focuses. So the first is general demographics. So this could be questions of whether families have used workbooks like this before. Then there's the primary question with these 3 focuses in mind. So usability asks questions such as, did the parents find this to be an appropriate reading level for their children? Acceptability asks questions of whether the parents found this to be culturally relevant. And finally, efficacy is asking parents whether they found the workbook to be useful. So like, were the kids using the exercises or were they communicating more with their parents and so on. Finally, there's also a secondary question of survey delivery format. I can talk about them more in Q&A as time permits. Okay, so I just spoke a lot about the workbook and the survey, but there were obviously some challenges with the development process. So some of the challenges of the development process have to do with working with an organization that has many other interventions that they're working on simultaneously. And I got a lot of insight into how taxing it is for NGO members in this realm. And they face a lot of burnout, which leads to staff turnover, which is actually part of the reason for the delay in the distribution for this specific project. But in this evaluation, I still wanted to discuss the limitations once I received, some results at some point. So remembering that the efficacy measurements are a secondary assessment. The parents are observing the child and then reporting back on their behavior. Another point is that the PRCS would be the one doing the distribution, so any feelings of either strong dislike or great gratitude towards the organization could bleed through in their responses. Finally, it's important to remember that the workbook won't be withheld from some children and given to others, so there's no real control versus treatment. And yet, I want to still discuss the significance once I receive some results. So if we were to get positive results, the workbook stands to be a feasible way to introduce concepts to a young audience. If it's successful, then it can provide families autonomy of not having to deal with a facilitator, or flexibility, being able to complete the workbook at their own leisure. Also, funding dependencies would be lower because you would only have to worry about distribution and then updates to the workbook as necessary. And with positive responses to the workbook, it could be considered a feasible alternative delivery mechanism for parental education, as well as a tool that can strengthen familial relationships while building healthy habits. So this project would not have been possible without these people and organizations. My co-authors on the workbook, advisors, and consulting experts were just critical to the development. So thank you all, and I can take your questions at this time.
Questions, great.
Thank you. So great work. I think what I'm curious about is just how is it like working with an NGO like PRCS? I think that's an amazing opportunity just to get to collaborate with someone with a group like that and the people that are on field in Palestine. So I think that's just a general question. How's it like?
Yeah, it was actually really interesting because every time we had a meeting with them, we'd go in with this tension of oh my goodness, they're gonna ask us so many questions. But then they would come back to us and they'd be like, oh my gosh, thank you for your time. Here are our edits, here's what we'd like to see. And they were just normal people, obviously, but it was, sometimes you forget that they're normal people. And so it was just always a positive experience that we had with them. And they just kept giving us more guidance and more direction as to where they would have liked to see the workbook go. And we were just there to help implement that vision.
There were challenges, too, that you point to. Do you want to elaborate on some of those challenges?
Yeah, so I mean, in general, working with an organization like that, there's also you're working between emails and trying to meet on their time, time zone differences and things like that. So I think in general, COVID really also, it kind of helped in this situation in that everybody was online, so people had time for projects like this. But the flip side was that we were working from a distance, and so we were getting all this great advice, but the timeline was just not as compact as you might want it to be. But it was still really great that we were able to author this whole workbook. Yeah.
Really wonderful presentation. If you were able to expand it for maybe have another year, or would you be interested in expanding it to another region, a different age group? Where would you like to see it go in the future?
Yeah, so I think definitely a different region. So when we had first talked with the PRCS about it, the director of the youth program there was like, if this works out well with Palestinian groups, I've got some contacts for Syrian refugees, and we could totally move it over there, because the culture and the community aspect that's really prevalent in Palestinian community is also very prevalent in Syrian communities. And so that was definitely one direction that I definitely could see this program going in. Another point, and I talk about in my evaluation would have been really interesting, is like following this workbook up with something for like kids a little bit older, and like kind of following the children with more workbooks. That would obviously be a larger scale, like more time-consuming thing, but I definitely think expanding to a different audience for sure.
I know another major concern was with the stigma against talking about mental health, much less intervening. Could you say a little bit about how you sought to navigate that challenge, and maybe also how the PRCS helped you?
Yeah, so one of the big things about this workbook and the survey is we never use the words or the phrase mental health. Immediately that would turn people off, and so we circumvent the phrase with other things, just talking about emotions or like being aware of your emotions and things like that, putting it in a context that children would understand, but also not to immediately turn off parents from the idea of using this workbook. And that was something we had done, like we had used the word mental health throughout when we first went to them, and they gave us that advice, and it made a lot of sense, but that was definitely something we got from their guidance and their expertise.
I suppose a similar question about how to make sure that the workbook is culturally relevant and appropriate. How did you navigate that challenge?
Yeah, I think a big part of that was listening to, again, the experts in the field, like who were there and had seen other tools being used, and they knew what worked and what didn't within this community. So just examples of like using appropriate names and like the illustrations, like making them just friendly to kids, but also like we always got their approval on, like even in the survey, like the language that was used, everything was always checked off by the organization. So we knew that going in, like if this was like when this does get distributed, it's not like we just came in and like gave something to someone and like it had no check. It's definitely been through those rounds of making sure it was culturally appropriate.
And since I know you were the artist as well, I don't know if everyone caught that. How did you determine the style of the artwork? Also in relation to culture.
Honestly, I don't know if I have a style. It was just kind of like looking at other workbooks, just trying to see what would work and then what would make the most sense for this workbook, and then again going back and forth with the psychologist to make sure that they found it to be appropriate. So I think there was like 2 rounds with the the drawn children. So yeah.